We're going to do something that I rarely want to do on this podcast, which is start with foreign policy. But Steve, it must be your birthday, or maybe I've had too much Spanish wine. So here we are, and I want to talk about this headline. Rubio and Witkoff bail on crucial Ukraine talks amid Crimea split. So this is Secretary of State Marco Rubio and United States Special Envoy to the Middle East, oddly, Witkoff. And I'll read you a couple quotes. The Trump administration wants to focus on the president's peace deal plan presented to Ukraine as a take it or leave it option. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Tuesday that Ukraine had yet to receive any official proposals from the U.S. and would never recognize Crimea or any other territories as Russian because such a move would go against the Ukrainian constitution. Quote, "There is nothing to talk about. This violates our constitution. This is our territory, the territory of the people of Ukraine." United States Vice President J.D. Vance responded that the U.S. had issued a very explicit proposal to Russia and Ukraine to end the conflict and threatened to walk away if progress is not forthcoming. Well, Steve, was it always going to end this way? I mean, I guess I don't understand what we've been doing these last few months and why the United States thought they could wave a magic wand and end a conflict that Russia started for territorial advancement when the other side doesn't want said territorial concessions.
Yeah. I should just point out that President Trump responded to the quotes that you read from Volodymyr Zelensky in a rather intemperate post on Truth Social on Wednesday, sort of once again blaming Zelensky for being the obstacle to peace here, blaming the victim of the aggression for being the obstacle to peace here. Look, I think the frustration for Donald Trump is that he wants this war to end. He promised he would do it on day one, and he's failed. But he's failed because he's on Russia's side, and Russia wants more from the Trump administration. What we've seen since the beginning of the Trump administration is preemptive capitulation, preemptive concession after preemptive concession. And if you're Vladimir Putin, you look at what the United States is doing on his behalf, and you say, why would we stop this non-negotiation when we are getting everything we want? And at this point, I think Putin would be crazy to enter any serious peace talks. And Putin apparently thinks it would be crazy to enter any serious peace talks. If you look at what he did just over this past weekend, he announced a 30-hour ceasefire over Easter and promptly violated it. I mean, didn't really wait at all, didn't really pretend that there was a ceasefire. This is not anything new. Vladimir Putin's been doing this for years. He announces a ceasefire and then violates it right away. Gets, I think, sort of a press hit over the announcement of the ceasefire. It's harder and harder to report on the details of the violations of the ceasefires. But go back to March 11th. Go back to what the Ukrainians agreed to in early March, which was an unconditional ceasefire that the Trump administration had proposed to create space for additional negotiation. Vladimir Putin didn't agree to that and continued not only to maintain his attacks, he has escalated his attacks. Russia has escalated its attacks, particularly on civilian populations. He's making a mockery of Donald Trump and the United States. And I find that, if it weren't so serious, it would be amusing that the Trump administration and Marco Rubio and others are in such high dudgeon about claims that they are effectively doing the Russians' bidding. There was a Politico story yesterday about the possibility that the United States was going to lift sanctions on Russia, and Marco Rubio took to Twitter and said, this is fake news, this is outrageous, Politico should retract this, et cetera, as if it were outrageous to believe that the United States might be open to lifting sanctions on Russia related to Nord Stream and other things. It's worth remembering that at the beginning of March, when the United States first held negotiations with Russia and Saudi Arabia, not the Ukrainians, excluded Ukraine from these negotiations, Marco Rubio went out and gave a press conference in which he discussed the quote unquote incredible opportunities for U.S.-Russia economic cooperation and historic things to come if the war would end, because the United States would then have an open relationship. They talked about normalizing diplomatic relations. It's not at all ridiculous to think that the United States is offering Russia lifting of the sanctions. They've effectively said that in public. It should be said that we're recording this Thursday morning. Donald Trump did put out a tweet or a Truth Social this morning after the deadliest attack on Kyiv since last summer by the Russians, killing 9 people and injuring more than 60. Donald Trump put out a Truth Social saying, "I am not happy with the Russian strikes on Kyiv, not necessary and very bad timing. Vladimir, stop. 5,000 soldiers a week are dying. Let's get the peace deal done." I think that's the harshest thing Donald Trump may have ever said to Vladimir Putin. And it's not very harsh given the context and the history that I just related.
David, it seems to me from a domestic policy standpoint that the win for Donald Trump is that he just wants it to be over, and he doesn't really care how that happens. What is the path then for a Trump victory in all of this? Because I guess I was told once we sort of stopped helping Ukraine, they would have to fold. And that would be that because of the overwhelming, force and depth of the Russian military. I mean, is Europe stepping in to fill the gap here? Why hasn't Ukraine folded like we were told?
Well, several reasons. One, the most principal reason being Ukraine does not want to fold. Ukraine wants to continue fighting. Number two, Ukraine has far more capacity to fight right now than it had 2 years ago, for example. It has far more capacity to continue the fight. It has built an indigenous drone industry that's pretty remarkable, the way that they've created it, that is just pouring drones into the front line to the point where large majority now of Russian casualties aren't due to the American manufactured weapons that are being sent over or the European manufactured weapons, but a large majority of the casualties are related to drones, and mainly the Ukrainian drones. Also, Ukraine hasn't folded in part because in important ways, Russia is weakened. Now, Russia has dramatically increased the size of its military. It has hundreds of thousands of troops at the border, much more than existed at the start of the war. Both the militaries are much larger than they were at the start of the war, but Russia just has less capacity to engineer a breakthrough through the lines. I mean, thousands of armored vehicles have been destroyed, for example. So there's just the reality on the ground that Ukraine has more indigenous capacity. Europe has continued to step up. It still has some remaining weapons and American weapons and munitions. And Russia's quick strike, combined arms offensive capabilities have really been weakened a great deal. And so what we're reduced to, and what the front is reduced to, is this just grinding war of attrition. It's not exactly like World War I, because you don't see the same kind of deep, dense trench lines stretching for the same hundreds of miles. But you've kind of created through drones a de facto version of this. And so two things have happened here at once. One, Ukraine is more self-sufficient. Ukraine has binded itself with our European allies, or its European allies, very tightly. They understand the stakes very, very, very clearly, and they continue to step up. And then number two, Russia is different. Russia is utterly committed to this fight. And I was talking to some observers of the war beforehand, and they said one of the things that I asked was about Trump's capacity to bring this war to a close. And they said Trump doesn't realize how much Vladimir Putin is a different Vladimir Putin than the person that he interacted with in his first term. And the person that he interacted with in his first term had not lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, had not been deeply enmeshed in a brutal war for several years, and that Putin has hardened. Putin has less interest in making deals. He has committed himself to winning this war. And so it's a situation that is not as amenable to America just walking in, bigfooting the whole situation, and working its will. And especially when Ukraine now accurately perceives it as essentially on the other side. And so this is not U.S. is not seen as a good faith broker here. It's not seen as a neutral arbiter or even a Ukrainian ally. It's now being perceived as a Russian ally, imposing Russian demands on a nation that has spilled an enormous amount of blood to prevent those demands from being enacted, and trying to impose them on a continent that still possesses considerable industrial and military power that also doesn't want to yield to Russia. And so he doesn't have the capacity to make everybody surrender. The parties are not committed to surrender. And so he walked into this way, way out of his depth compared to the rhetoric that he brought into it.
Jonah, when this war started in America, it was perceived and described as almost a metaphor for, or a historical analog for Hitler, but also just this like warning for Europe. You know, Ukraine's first, but then it's Poland and yada, yada, yada. Russia owns England or something like that. And so that was, the American interest was stop him in Ukraine because it's in our interest to not have to deal with this when it's a NATO country, or to not deal with this when it's all of Europe, etc. Not surprisingly, that message emanating from the administration has stopped. I wonder if that's still how it's viewed in Europe, though, because it does feel like there's been an overall shift in the vibes, if you will. This is feeling more like a unique situation between Russia and Ukraine, not one that maybe the Europeans see necessarily as that grander moment in history.
So I promise I will answer that question. I just want to make one quick point about Trump's negotiating stuff that Steve and David referenced. Trump said that Zelensky is much more difficult to deal with than Putin. And of course, Zelensky is much more difficult to deal with, right? Let's say I'm going to have this deal. Sarah, you get $1 million and a house on the cliff in the Caribbean with access to the beach. Steve, you get root canal and a colonoscopy with no anesthesia. Now, weirdly, Steve is much more difficult to deal with in the negotiations. Trump is giving Putin pretty much everything he wants. He's rewarding what he's doing. And Zelensky's like, hold your roll. You're trying to dismember my country and just basically postpone future aggression against me by Russia. So he's the difficult guy, right? Because he's the guy getting screwed in these negotiations. I think your point about how it seemed, how the conversation has changed is a good one. I think it's accurate to the extent that it's sort of like, I'll put it in sort of AO terms. Recall how you guys used to talk all the time about how much easier it was for Republicans to take a hardcore pro-life position so long as Roe v. Wade was preventing them to have any accountability to do anything about abortion? When Western Europe was pretty confident that America was going to take the lead on all of this, it got their backs to sort of be much more principled and forthright in a lot of ways, particularly the further west you got. When all of a sudden it looks like much more of their blood and treasure in the game or at stake, it introduces a dose of realism. That said, you talk to the people in the Baltics, right? You talk to the people in Poland who have living memory of Russian aggression against them. They still talk the way a lot of us talked about it immediately after the invasion, and for good reason. Yeah. And I think this stuff, because of crazy domestic politics in Germany, it's very difficult to figure out where Germany is on any of this stuff at any given moment. But I generally think that when you listen to the EU types, when you listen to the Brits, they still see this as a pretty, not existential, but a high stakes contest of high principle and also of real stakes for them. And one way to think about it is, look, I mean, in the Iran context, everyone's like, what's the big deal? Iran's going to get a nuclear bomb. It's not like it's going to nuke all its neighbors, or even Israel probably, because it would get nuked back, right? So why do people freak out about it? They freak out about it in part, at least the smart people do, because Iran's goal is to be the regional hegemon, to call the shots about how the whole region works, and eventually to push Israel into the sea and all that kind of stuff. But a nuke would let it do that. Russia on the border with NATO, on Poland, Poland's border and all that kind of stuff, after having crushed Ukraine, would be able to flex further and further west into Europe, and the Europeans understand that. And so, like, it's not so much that Putin is going to have a triumph in Paris. It's that Putin, both with his energy resources and his military, would be able to dictate the foreign policy course for the rest of Europe in ways that Europeans don't think is awesome, and that people like J.D. Vance don't give a rat's ass about.
Speaking of that, I want to stay with you for a second and expand out into what is Trump's foreign policy, and what have we learned about Trump's foreign policy that we didn't know, from the campaign or from his first term? How is Trump's second term foreign policy different than maybe either what you'd seen before or what you expected? And it's sort of brought to mind because of the news swirling around Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. There was another Signal chat where he's talking to his wife, brother, and lawyer about attacks on Yemen. There was, of course, his aide who wrote an op-ed saying that Hegseth would not be long for the administration. There were articles to that effect as well. I'm not interested in, will they, won't they, rom-com status of anonymous sources around Pete Hegseth, but I am interested in what Pete Hegseth stands for in the administration and what it says about Trump's foreign policy when Pete Hegseth gets confirmed, when Pete Hegseth stays despite distractions. So back to my original question, what have you learned about Trump's foreign policy?
Yeah, so I think I never really liked the phrase isolationist. I've written a lot about this, that isolationism was a wildly misunderstood thing. It's not inherently right-wing. There have been lots of left-wing isolationists in American history. And besides, we never really came up with a really good term for what Trump is. It's not isolationism. And then there's this argument that I'm pretty persuaded by, that he's what a very obscure group of people call a sovereigntist. And sovereigntism, as in sovereignty, is basically the idea that nobody is the boss of us, that we shouldn't have, it's not that we should have, the classic expression of what isolationism is Fortress America, no entangling alliances, bring everybody home, hide behind the oceans, that kind of stuff. The sovereigntist position is, we just get to do whatever the damn hell we want. And that was part of the argument. The original sovereigntists were a hardcore group of we call them the irreconcilables in the arguments over the Treaty of Versailles. And they weren't isolationists per se. I mean, some were, but the key thing there was that they didn't want alliances with our friends. They didn't want to be beholden to any kind of pact that said we had to fight if we didn't want to, or that we couldn't fight if we didn't want to. They basically just wanted to be completely unencumbered. And Donald Trump came in, even before he was sworn in, when he was just president-elect, started talking about taking back the Panama Canal, wouldn't rule out force for Greenland, started saying all sorts of things about the border with Canada, which he's revisited in the last week. And then short time later, the whole Mara Gaza idea of basically turning over the Gaza Strip into a resort community of some kind. That's not isolationism. That's just Trump getting to do what he wants where he wants, which is why this sovereigntist, which is a terrible label, no one's going to start using it regularly, but it's why the sovereigntist thing, I think, applies best to his foreign policy. And so the way that gets translated into the bureaucracy or into the foreign policy establishment is, first of all, you can't do anything that Donald Trump doesn't want to do. So, and therefore we have to do everything that Donald Trump does want to do. And you have to praise his strength and his vigor and strong like bull leadership and all that kind of stuff. And that plays into Pete Hegseth, because Pete Hegseth is basically there to be a recruitment video and to do push-ups and to talk about being warriors and manly. What we're warriors for and when, I think, is a secondary consideration for that crowd. And the problem is that he's hired a bunch. And then we can hand it off to Steve or Dave, but he hired a bunch of people around him who actually do have ideology and don't like American leadership in the world, even sovereigntist leadership, and they don't like the idea of taking Israel's side in a contest with Iran. And this is one of the things that's gotten them into a lot of hot water, is because the most dangerous thing you can do in the Trump administration is have a strong commitment to any principle, right or wrong. Like, it is worse for you to be committed to a wrong principle than to have no principles at all, because that's going to get you crosswise with Trump, who basically just doesn't want to be constrained by any intellectual constructs whatsoever, which is why this sovereigntist thing, I think, is the most apt way to describe his foreign policy.
David, what have you learned about Trump's foreign policy today that you didn't know, in December?
Yeah, I think that's really easy to answer for me. It really is what you would say. I like that sovereigntist label, but it's manifesting itself in a particular kind of foreign policy that's very old. It's in the term that's often used as spheres of influence. Yeah. So one of the ways you can make sense of Trump's approach to Russia and Ukraine and his approach to the United States and Canada is to realize that he sees Ukraine as in Russia's sphere of influence, and he sees Canada as within our sphere of influence, and similarly Greenland, etc. And so the big boys, the big guys, get to do what they want to do in their sphere of influence. And so this is one of the reasons why he's consistently poking at Zelensky for having some role here in this war breaking out. Because remember, he thinks the obligation of Ukraine, much like the obligation of Canada to just sort of yield to our demands, the obligation to Ukraine is to yield to the demands of Russia, the superpower in its core sphere of influence. This is one of the reasons why, you see this kind of mockery, this idea in parts of the MAGA right that why would we ever lose a single life to defend the Baltic states? Or you're even starting to see in some parts of the right, while a lot of the Trump right really is trying to pivot to the Pacific and stand against the Chinese threat, very concerned about Taiwan's fate, another part of the MAGA right really doesn't give a rip about Taiwan one way or the other. That's in China's sphere of influence. And so this is one way that you can make sense of this really hard heel turn that America has made, is that it has gone from a internationalist foreign policy that seeks a cooperative alliance with partners, not subordinates, even though we were in many ways first among equals, given our raw economic and military strength, into something that is a lot more like Putin's Russia, which is a powerful nation seeking to control its near abroad, while leaving other powerful nations to control their near abroad. And so this is seen as maybe creating a more stable international environment, but it is not. It is not a more stable international environment. And we have actual history as to how that spheres of influence approach works, because nobody actually ends up agreeing on where one sphere ends and the other sphere begins. And every large power gets insecure on the edges of its sphere of influence when they brush up against others. And so this creates this inherent constant tension as the different spheres overlap and bump into each other. And that's what he is creating. I mean, this is how you make sense of make sort of holistic sense of this approach. It's another reason why he's so reluctant to be so forward deployed, say, in Korea. He raises Japan, and why are we obligated to do anything with Japan? All of this stuff is outside of our sphere of influence, and in his view, inside the sphere of influence of his true peers in his mind, Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. And so this is when you understand that concept, so much of Trump's foreign policy starts to make sense. He really does sort of view himself as having maybe two peers in the world, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Everyone else is either subordinate to him in our sphere or subordinate to them in their spheres. And when you get that, what is happening starts to make a lot more sense.
Yeah, so I agree with all of that. I read a bunch about it. I just want to add one point. I think one way to think about it that really is illuminating is because I think it reflects both the way he looks at domestic politics and the way he looks at foreign policy. We all call it, because we read eggheadery stuff, spheres of influence and all that kind of stuff. It's really just Don Corleone style, right?
Yes.
Where
Three families.
In your mob family, there are three families. In your family,
yeah,
if your earners don't kick up enough and show you respect, you can kick the crap out of them. Go get your shine box, right? But the head of another family, he deserves respect.
Right.
And the whole trick is to bend everybody else to your knee and demand respect for them. And I think that explains a lot of his approach to like the law firms. I think that explains a lot of his approach to his. It's why he's always been meaner to the Republican Party, to Republicans, than he is to like the opponents. In part because he wants the subservience from them.
Yeah,
Steve.
I think that's right. That's where I was going to go with this. I mean, I buy. I think the sovereigntist framing is smart, and I think David's right. Generally speaking, about the spheres of influence, I would ascribe those views more to his top aides than to Donald Trump. I don't think Donald Trump sits at the Resolute desk and thinks about spheres of influence.
Of course,
I think this is much
or
less,
sovereigntism. Yeah, I agree with that.
Or sovereigntism. This is much
he's read
less
multiple papers on it, Jonah.
Right. This is much less geostrategic and geopolitical and much more psychological. And I think Jonah's last point is the most important one. He wants people who pay obeisance to Trump, and he wants people who allow him to look powerful. And, I mean, he said this. He's not particularly shy about talking about it in these terms. I mean, when Kim Jong-un is saying nice things to him, Donald Trump talks about writing love letters to Kim Jong-un. And when other leaders praise him in the way that we've all grown accustomed to, he looks at them in a different kind of way. And it's why you see, whether it's the head of NATO sitting in the Oval Office, or Putin, or even to a lesser extent, but even the Iranians to a certain extent, not challenging Trump rhetorically, and often praising him when you know that they don't mean the praise, because Trump wants this and Trump needs this. I don't think Trump has a particular worldview. I think so much of it is just psychological and it's ad hoc. But I do think it really is the case that many of the people who work for him not only have strong worldviews, but have strong sort of deep ideological views that they are, that many of them have spent their careers working on behalf of, and they are using those to try to direct his decision making. I would say J.D. Vance is certainly one of those, but that's one of the things that's led to this, quiet, I would say simmering, but really intense fight sort of behind the scenes between whatever we want to call them, the actual sovereigntists, the non-interventionists. I do think there are some real sort of old school isolationists there, and the people who I would just describe as having more conventional sort of Reaganite foreign policy views. And by almost everything that we can see that emerges in public, we'll just call them non-interventionists for simplicity's sake, are winning those battles behind the scenes, both in terms of personnel, in terms of policy decisions, and I think in terms of their access and influence on Donald Trump.
So, Steve, just to follow up on, sort of where we started this, I felt like during the first Trump administration, for almost any question facing Donald Trump, there were two schools within his administration, if not more. And that was the battle we always saw playing out. That's what caused the leaks. That's what caused the constant personnel turnover, was those tectonic plates bumping up against each other as the Republican Party realigned away from Ronald Reagan and towards Donald Trump. And I guess what's interesting to me, you said there's still two schools in there. I guess I don't necessarily feel that way. It feels like that tectonic plate bumping has like worked itself out, and clearly one school won, to the extent that there are individuals, let's say in the Department of Defense apparatus, who are from that older school of foreign policy. Fair enough. But do you think there are actually senior members of this administration that still hold opposition views, or is that the main difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2? We're done with the fighting.
I mean, it's
one side won.
Yeah. It's you don't mean it as a trick question. It's almost a trick question. What do I think Marco Rubio actually believes? I think Marco Rubio is a Reaganite. I think he's a Reaganite. But every day he goes out in public and makes these arguments that I genuinely don't think he believes. In some cases that directly contradict things that he was doing as a senator, months ago. Right. I mean, you look at what he was doing on Russia and legislation that he introduced, things that he inserted into the National Defense Authorization Act that would have held Russia accountable for the invasion of Ukraine, that would have prevented us from lifting sanctions. That's what Marco Rubio believes. That's the way he operated as a senator. Those are the things that he said in his public speeches. And he's going out every day and saying things I just think he genuinely doesn't believe. I think the same thing is true with Mike Waltz. I mean, I've covered Marco Rubio for a long time. I think I have a pretty good sense of what he believes. Mike Waltz is the same way. I knew Mike Waltz a little bit. He was a sort of omnipresent at Fox News back in the day. I think it's one of the reasons he was chosen for this job. He made himself available to Fox News. He was on Fox News on a near daily basis, sometimes more than some Fox News anchors, it seemed, and presented himself to Donald Trump that way, but he was privately a never Trumper until shortly before the 2020 election, when he endorsed Trump publicly, but harbored real reservations about Trump and what Trump believed, in particular in the national security and foreign policy space. And I think Waltz has attempted to bring in some people, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to the National Security Council staff who have views and have advocated policies that are much more in line with the old school Reaganite foreign policy. Some of those people have been purged. You remember just 3 weeks ago, there was, 3 staffers were fired in the aftermath of Laura Loomer making a surprise visit to the White House.
Steve, we all know that was 3 years ago. Not 3 weeks ago. That's not possible.
It feels like it. But Trump is getting, he's getting that pressure from the, again, non-interventionists for simplicity's sake, from people like Laura Loomer, from the hardcore MAGA crowd, from Tucker Carlson, who has tremendous influence on J.D. Vance, internally from J.D. Vance and others in the administration. That's why I think you're right to say, just as a factual matter, we don't have somebody like Mike Pompeo. We don't have somebody like Mike Pence. We don't have somebody like Jim Mattis who were making those arguments internally. And I think, ended up doing a tremendous amount of good, keeping President Trump from following his instincts on some of these things, including meeting with the Taliban on September 11th, as he proposed in his first term. And we don't have those people making those arguments now. And to the extent, we don't know what everything Marco Rubio is arguing behind the scenes. There have been reports that he's, resisted immediately lifting sanctions on Russia, but nothing he says in public suggests that he holds the views he held 12 months ago. And in that sense, I think you are right. In that sense, I think the fight is virtually over. It's just a matter of how long somebody like Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio can survive. And one last postscript on this. One of the questions we talk about a lot on this podcast and elsewhere is why Republicans, senators who disagree with these policies aren't more outspoken. And I think one of the reasons they're not, or weren't more critical of Mike Waltz in the context of Signalgate, And one of the reasons is because they're worried if they criticize Waltz or criticize what the National Security Council is doing, or pick public fights with Marco Rubio, they diminish the power of each of those individuals inside the administration, and could lead to a hastier exit than these Republican members of Congress would like.
Yeah, just a quick add on that. When I gave my original answer, at one point, the point I made was that having strong convictions about anything gets you in more trouble than not. Another way of putting that is that the difference between the reason why it seems like these debates have been settled is that everyone's been institutionalized, to put it in Shawshank terms. Like, they're just cowards now. And it doesn't really matter what they believe. I mean, a belief's got nothing to do with it. It's like, what are you willing to fight for? And the answer is not much. Like, Scott Bessent, who I'm not a huge fan of, but he is the smartest, most serious person on that financial team, has to wait until after we lose trillions of dollars of value to say, see, I was kind of right. He doesn't have the ability to persuade Trump not to do things until reality backs up his position. And he doesn't have the willingness to fight for these things at a high enough level to prevent bad things from happening. The story from the first term, I mean, there were so many people, Paul Ryan was chief among them, but they would talk about, you guys don't understand the number of things that we prevented from happening. And
we're beginning to see
those people don't exist in this administration for the most part. I mean, I'm sure we'll get stories about some things being prevented from happening that will make your, hair stand on end. But the reality is that these people were picked. I mean, all those loyalty tests, who were the real patriots on January, 6th, all that kind of stuff that's been reported for a long time. There's a reason for that. You guys have been covering it on the the prosecutors, side, going back to the Eric Adams thing. This administration is picking people that the first priority isn't what they believe. It's how supine they're willing to be and deferential to Donald Trump's authority, and how much they're willing to sublimate any of their own convictions to whatever Donald Trump says. And so by that standard, you get a lot of people with some crazy ass ideas. But the crazy ass ideas are still secondary to the just abject loyalty to Trump. And that's the real difference between 1.0 and 2.0.
Wait, can I jump in on that real fast? I think, one of the things about Trump he's ignorant of many things, but he's a very politically shrewd person. I mean, you can't look at winning 2 presidential elections. You can't look at his comebacks from, political, from political ruin time and time again, and not say the guy doesn't have some shrewd political instincts. And here's one of them that he has. I think you hacked early on that very few people will actually, truly bear any risk for their political convictions at all. And so they will posture online. They will say this and that and talk about, how the barracks soldier, while he's heading to the front, is like, I can't wait to get to the enemy. And then when he's at the front, it's like, how can I dig a deeper hole to hide from the enemy? He realized that very few people will bear any risk. And we've seen this with Republican members of Congress and Republican senators for years. We're starting to see
media personalities.
Media personalities.
Yes.
And we're starting to see it with more institutions. So one of the things about the Paul Weiss letter and the immediate Paul Weiss capitulation, there were 2 big lessons there. One was you had this giant, very wealthy institution, predominantly on the left. Trump came at them frontally. And I can imagine that if one day before Trump came at them frontally, almost to a person, they would say, we're strong, we're brave, we're strong, we're brave. Then he comes at them. They prove not to be as strong or brave. And then you have the other part of this is the community around Paul Weiss doesn't rally to help Paul Weiss. According to the Paul Weiss chair, some of them start trying to poach Paul Weiss's lawyers. Some of them start trying to poach Paul Weiss's clients. And so what you see is Trump understands a couple of things. People are not as brave as they imagine that they'll be. And then when stuff hits the fan, a lot of people will start looking for their angle for themselves rather than defending higher principle. when you combine those two things, then you realize how Trump is exerting such remarkable power over the American body politic right now. Is he realized people are not as brave as they think they are.
Can I add one important point? I think it's an important point to what David is saying. It's that, but I would also say Trump also recognizes, I think, because he sees this, he knows this about himself, that it's not just that people won't stand up for the beliefs that they have articulated or that they seem to hold. It's that a lot of people in politics don't believe anything. Like they don't actually really care about stuff, right?
That.
I mean, it's a means to an end. They articulate conservative views to win in red states, but they don't really care. They want to be in politics to be famous or to be on television or to cast votes or because they think it's prestigious. I mean, this is, again, one of the things that I think has been sort of a rude awakening for me over the past decade is all of these people whom I'd gotten to know, over my 25 years in the conservative movement, who, would thunder, make loud and aggressive arguments about free trade and tariffs, and then just capitulate at a moment's notice. It's not just that some of them, I think it's true, they just won't defend it when there's pressure that, they worry about not being close to power. They worry about saying the wrong thing. But I think for some of them, they never really believed it that much. And I think Trump, as somebody who I don't think has many, deeply held views, recognizes that in a lot of the people he works with.
Speaking along these lines a bit, I wanted to also compare the first Trump administration to the second Trump administration, looking through the lens of the vice president and Mike Pence and J.D. Vance. David, can you imagine for a moment that January 6th didn't happen? So take that just totally out of consideration for a moment. What would you think about Mike Pence being replaced by J.D. Vance, what the biggest differences were, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, you take January 6th out of it, and I would say, okay, replacing Mike Pence with J.D. Vance is a signal of an ideological shift or a signal of that Trump, because if we've talked about, Trump doesn't have much of an ideology, although I think we sometimes exaggerate how little ideology he had. There are some things he's been pretty consistent on over the years: tariffs, immigration, etc. So you would look at it and you'd say, wait, is this meaning that this really is the next turn of the ideological evolution of the Republican Party? The last vestiges of Reagan republicanism are being tossed aside in favor of J.D. Vance. But the more accurate read would probably be, he just doesn't like Mike Pence. Mike Pence frustrated him too much. And now he wants somebody who will frustrate him less and is more aligned, more prone to just do whatever he wants. And I think that when we talk about influence, about the president, who has more influence over the president, I think, we're going on a very partial record, but it seems to me that Pence had more influence and Vance may say things, but ultimately Vance is the enabler. Pence was somebody who was selected as a kind of concession to Trump's perceptions of the old Republican Party. Look, evangelicals, I have an evangelical vice president. Look, conservatives, I have a traditional conservative vice president. He doesn't need any of that anymore. None of that. And one of the things we know is that there was influence that Reagan side had on Trump, often kind of by throwing their body in front of him, but there was influence there. What influence does J.D. Vance have? One of the insights from the Signal chat was basically, hey, he raises his hand, not sure about this. They do it anyway. All right, I'm going to go support this. So here you had the first big military action of the Trump presidency from, thanks to the ridiculous OPSEC of the Trump administration. We now have some insight into the dynamics. And it looked like Stephen Miller just waltzed into that chat and bigfooted the heck out of J.D. Vance. And so I think J.D. Vance is in the inner circle, but being in the inner circle is not the same thing as influence.
Jonah, is J.D. Vance the heir to the new Republican Party?
I'm assuming you're blowing a kiss to a child of some sort and not me, as you ask that question.
No, it's to you. It's absolutely to you.
Weird. What are you trying to get him to say, Sarah?
I thought there was just like some weird code here. Is J.D. Vance the heir of the Republican Party? Mwah. Are you blowing Vance a kiss? Me a kiss? What's going on here? All right. Anyway, I apologize.
Always
keep that
you,
in or take
Jonah.
it out. I don't care.
Always Jonah.
So no. I think there are two ways to talk about this, and I know a lot of people who just simply assert that Vance is, next in line going to be not only is he going to be the candidate in 2028, but he'll obviously win. And I think those are bootstrapping assumptions, one after the other, that are very difficult to logically defend. Of the field, I think Vance has the best chances of being the nominee because we don't know who the field is. And so you can't ascribe probabilities to anybody else, really. But I think if you gave me a bet where I got to bet on Vance or bet on the field, bet on everybody else, I'd bet on everybody else. Like, I think he's got like a 25%, 30% chance of being the nominee, which is better than anybody else you can name right now because we're so far out. But it's not like a lock by any stretch of the imagination. And I find the wish casting on the Vance crowd's part really kind of remarkable, where they just sort of think that Trump's cult of personality gets passed along as his inheritance. And it just doesn't work like that. It used to be, it reminds me a lot of the people who thought that because Bill Clinton was a really, really good politician, that it became community property, and therefore Hillary was a really, really good politician, right? And it's like, if my wife knows how to play the piano, that doesn't mean I know how to play the piano. Just because Bill was good doesn't mean Hillary was good. And there was a lot of projection that way. There are a lot of people in Vance world who want to believe that because he is the most appealing guy to a small slice of the MAGA coalition, that therefore he will get the entirety of the MAGA coalition. Do we really think that, like, first of all, Ron DeSantis is going to be like, oh, well, J.D. Vance was Trump's vice president, so I have to defer to him out of respect. I shall therefore not seek nor accept the nomination of my party for president. Like, Tom Cotton, that guy, with the 1,000-yard stare is going to like say, yeah, no, I'm scared of dealing with J.D. Vance. It's just not going to happen. And so there's going to be a contest. I do think he has captured he has won the hearts and minds of the sort of the neo-isolationist, sovereigntist, non-interventionist, whatever that crowd is. He's won them over. He's their guy to a certain extent. And he's probably got an advantage to some extent with the people who just want to reward MAGA, loyalty to Trump. But other than that, I never thought he was that particularly good a politician. Of the 6 senators that were the super Trumpy backed by Trump and Peter Thiel and those guys in the 2022 cycle, 5 of them lost. And J.D. Vance barely won by like 6 points when normie Mike DeWine, the governor of Ohio, won by like 28 points, which means a whole bunch of people who wanted to vote for a Republican didn't want to vote for Vance because they didn't like him. I don't think Vance has gotten more likable or expanded his appeal since he's been Trump's vice president. So I'm very skeptical of all of this Vance talk.
Steve, did J.D. Vance kill the Pope? No, I'm kidding.
He did not. He did not.
Can you prove it?
I'll just jump in.
He was the last person seen with him alive. I mean, I'm just going to put it out there. But anyway, go on.
It's true. I'm not ready to blame him. We don't have evidence. We shouldn't engage in such speculation. I think that the big difference between Pence and Vance, and there are a number of them, but I think the biggest one is that Mike Pence was a check on Trump's authoritarian instincts, and to the extent that he has them, Trump's ideological views.
Did you,
Vance
though, before January 6th, did you think Mike Pence was a check on Trump?
I did. I
Okay.
did.
What were some
there
of the
were
moments?
plenty of times. Well, I think you could see from some of the. I mean, just having reported on some of the internal policy fights. I mean, I think that Trump's instincts would have had him impose many, many more tariffs across a much wider number of countries than he did had J.D. Vance not been in his ear. I think his instincts on pulling out of Afghanistan early was something that Pence weighed in strongly against. I think, Pence, there's this moment Pence describes in his book where he meets Vladimir Putin and effectively says, shakes his hand and effectively says, hey, don't mess with our elections anymore. J.D. Vance would never say or do anything like that. So I think Pence was a pretty effective. I think it's become clearer in retrospect and starker in contrast to J.D. Vance. But I think Pence was influential, and I think it was, you could see it, you could trace it if you were talking to folks in the administration.
Who do you think the heir apparent is?
I don't think there's an heir apparent, and that's part of the problem. There isn't anybody doing that. And not only is J.D. Vance not serving as that check, but he affirms Trump's authoritarian instincts and pulls him further in his own ideological direction. I think that's the main difference between the two. And, when Trump picked J.D. Vance, there was, I think, the general sense, the conventional wisdom as it gelled was he picked J.D. Vance because J.D. Vance was sort of in line with MAGA thinking. So he was MAGA like Trump. I guess my own view was at the time and continues to be Vance is something more like MAGA plus. He's pulling Trump further along those lines. If you think about some of the things that Vance has said publicly about, this post-liberal moment and the things that he wants to do, he's just unapologetic about it. He gave these interviews, or he said in a podcast, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people. He has sort of talked openly about being in this, quote, late Republican period. And he said, if we're going to push back against it, we have to get pretty wild, pretty far out there and go in directions that a lot of conservatives right now are uncomfortable with. He said that before he was in the administration. This is back in 2021. So J.D. Vance has shown sort of a comfort with sort of broader authoritarian impulses. And I think now when Donald Trump has those impulses, he's not only not hearing that he shouldn't do these things, he's having somebody who's egging him on.
Okay. Not worth your time. There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there, but one of the oldies is back, and that's that we didn't land on the moon. And it seems to be picking up some traction with the MAGA right, at least, or I don't know that that's fair. I think MAGA right can often be tagged for Trump voters. Here, I think we mean the pundit MAGA influencer right, the very online MAGA right, if that makes sense. Not just random Trump voters, I think, suddenly don't believe we landed on the moon. But Candace Owen, for instance, said that NASA is fake and gay. I don't know how fake things can also be gay, but sure, okay. So there's some questions about this. One, is it ever worth our time to talk about this stuff? But maybe two, why are conspiracy theories so popular right now? Is it actually some sort of MAGA thing, or is it just that overall conspiracy theories become more popular in an era of social media, and this is just, it's inevitable on the right and the left. The left has all sorts of conspiracy theories they believe in. Why the moon landing? Why has that been an obsession for so long? And there was one theory that I read that I was kind of like, oh, well, that wouldn't be great. That part of it is actually the Russian influence of trying to diminish American accomplishments. And so the reason that you make the conspiracy theory about the moon landing is because it's one of the premier American accomplishments against the Soviet Union and within that Cold War context. So if they can diminish that, make the American right question whether that even happened, it's harder to believe in American exceptionalism, I guess. So, David, do you believe we landed on the moon?
Do I believe we? Yeah, of course. I'm glad you raised the latter point, which is I saw somebody the other day saying Twitter accept only American accounts. In other words,
Yep.
could we, if you had a social media platform and we could ensure that only American users used it, or only people residing in America used it, I think you would actually be surprised at how different Twitter was.
Yep. 1,000 times yes.
Yeah. So a lot of what sort of the MAGA right calls engagement or views as engagement is often bot farming. It is often
Based in Russia. Yes.
Yes.
And also in India and some other places, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's scattered around the country, Macedonia, some of it. I mean, you can go through a list. So yeah, I mean, it is actually the case that there are a lot of Americans who are so distrustful of institutions and authority now that they are eager. It's not that they are open to the idea that they have been lied to. They're eager for confirmation that they've been lied to. They've become so anti-institutional or so opposed to anything that smacks of the old sort of Cold War, post-war regime, that they're just ready for it. They're ready, willing, and able. That population does exist. But what's fascinating to me is I can encounter lots of aspects of MAGA in the real world. Lots of aspects of MAGA that I see on Twitter, I encounter in the real world. But this super extreme, the moon landing, etc., that I don't see as much. I just don't encounter that as much. And I do often wonder how much of this is really being ginned up and amplified by the particular dynamics, particularly on X. So I think about that a lot. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that we do have a population of Americans who are so alienated from American political and cultural life that they're open to believing almost anything negative about the other, about them, about they. And so that is destabilizing. And, I don't exaggerate that. I don't think we should exaggerate about how much more it is now than it used to be. I've encountered conspiracy theorists all growing up. But when I was encountering conspiracy theorists growing up, often what I was encountering was an otherwise healthy, normal, functioning person who had these sort of conspiracies as like a side quirk. Oh, Jim, he's an awesome dude, but don't get him going on Kennedy assassination, like that kind of thing. But now you're seeing much more where the conspiracy becomes the identity. It's not the hobby, it's the identity. It's not the quirk, it's the essence. And that is, I think, one of the changes that we've seen. Hard to say how prevalent it is because of that very issue you identify, Sarah, but it is real.
Steve, it seems to me that if I were trying to have a grand MAGA strategy, I would want the main conspiracy theory to be 9/11 trutherness, because that discredits the part of the right that you're trying to cut off from now the Republican Party brand. The moon landing doesn't do a lot for me. We can sort of handle Russia now. Most of the people voting today weren't alive then. They don't remember the Soviet Union. And lo and behold, we did have a U.S. senator from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Like publicly say that he questions the acceptable narrative on 9/11 and that maybe it was the demolition of Building 7 in New York versus that it fell due to structural damage. So yeah, more conspiracy theories. What do you think?
I think it's not so much top down as it is bottom up. So I don't think this is like MAGA strategists saying, "Hey, here's how we can discredit the neocon right. Let's question 9/11 rather than moon landing." It's just, I think it's much more organic than that. But I think that what David describes about Jim and his quirky conspiracies, it was the case, back before the internet, that people who had these quirky views were, I think, a bit more reluctant to share them And if they did so almost sheepishly or apologetically, and would kind of, yeah, in a conversation with you, would maybe float it to see how you reacted, and then when you looked at them like they were crazy because the shit they were saying was crazy, then they would stop saying that crazy stuff. Now, with the ability to go online and find support for sort of anything and everything, people are much more inclined to be public about these views. And when you have somebody like Tucker Carlson, who, at this point seemingly embraces any conspiracy theory at all, just to embrace it's almost like it's more about embracing the conspiracy theory than it is about the stuff that he actually believes. But, we can actually trace this statement from Senator Ron Johnson, was a pretty conventional businessman from Wisconsin, knew him reasonably well, used to see him a lot on Capitol Hill, elected sort of in the Tea Party era as a small government anti-Obamacare guy. I would say had some quirky views, was not a typical politician in some ways. I think one of the reasons he was elected was because he didn't present as a normal politician, and he wanted to come and be kind of a disruptor, but maybe not a crazy person. But the stuff he's saying is crazy now. And I think the reason that he was asked about that, the reason he said what he said, was because Tucker Carlson had on a former representative named Kurt Weldon, who has long been a conspiracy theorist about 9/11, long been discredited. Talked to anybody who served in Congress with him, and the conversations you'll have is, wow, what happened to Kurt Weldon? And Tucker has him on. Weldon, I mean, when you watch the interview, Weldon is sort of, spittle-flecked assertions about 9/11 and Building 7, and suggesting this massive conspiracy that the U.S. government may have been involved or behind, or certainly covered up what actually happened on 9/11. And I think part of the reason that these things take off the way that they do is because of the speed of the internet and the sort of velocity of information these days. But it's also because, as David suggests, a lot of the big things that people were told over the years have turned out not to be true. Right? I mean, when you can point to something like the Dan Rather attempt to discredit George W. Bush on 60 Minutes based on forged documents, and people say, like, well, gosh, if people I trusted were doing that, why should I believe them on this other stuff? And you could, people will point to weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, things that they were told before the financial collapse, and all of these things where, you can certainly point to COVID and some of the things that people were told during COVID. And people say, like, I don't believe any of these authoritative figures anymore. I'm going to believe what I want to believe.
I think part of this is also the fall of the generalist. When we lived in a world where being a generalist was what everyone was and was enough to get you a job and career and provide for your family, it's much harder to have a conspiracy theory when now everyone is a specialist. So someone on the other end of the circle of specialization doesn't know anything about that specialization. It's really hard to understand how MMR vaccines work, for instance, or it's really hard to understand why you can't see stars in the black sky on the moon. Although that one's really not that hard to understand, but you know what I mean? Like, it's people notice problems in media, I've noticed, when it's in their specialty. They're like, oh my gosh, that's just not true. Like, I actually know a lot about this. But then when that same media source covers something they don't know about, they just assume whatever bad thing they're being told about that institution. Like, the institution I'm in, good. Everyone else's institution, definitely bad and corrupt and evil, because I'm not a specialist in that. Jonah, I feel like if anyone on this podcast believes in conspiracy theories, it's definitely you. He's making a shocked
Absolutely
face.
not. Yeah, no, I've been complaining about how
you didn't blow him kisses.
Yeah, so I'm just sitting here. So first of all, I am not a conspiracy theory guy, in part because part of my whole argument for years is, like, when I try to tell people, like, when you get asked the question, what's one thing about Washington that normal people don't realize? And the answer, my answer, which is the same as Yuval Levin's answer, we've been talking about this for years, is nobody in Washington runs anything, right? This idea that somehow really smart people can plan 25 moves ahead and account for all of the variables that are going to come into play. And once they roll out their press release,
their Signal chat, like,
right. So like the whole idea, everyone always thinks that there's some group behind some red rope that really is calling the shots, which gets me to my sort of answer on all this. So first of all, you said one of the oldest conspiracy theories. The moon landing stuff is one of the younger conspiracy theories. I mean, Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now that's an old, conspiracy theory. And that's so hot right now too. And I think in some ways for the same reason. I agree with everything that David and with what all you guys said. The only thing I would add on that part is that conspiracy theories are only fun and psychically rewarding if you're poking at something that has societal esteem and status. A conspiracy theory about how Lake Erie got polluted, no one cares about, right? But toppling, people's admiration for the moon landing, that has some cultural status to it. It's turning over a big turtle. Same thing with going after Jews. You get a reaction out of it. And you can tell why so many of the conspiracy theories are bad faith. It's because they're always about things that people have strong feelings about and never about things that people don't have strong feelings about, because the whole point is to poke at people's strong feelings. And so I will just close on that note by saying, Sarah, you said in your setup how you can't understand how something can be both fake and gay. Well, let me tell you a story. My mom and a bunch of her gay friends were in Las Vegas once, and they were having a grand time, as you can imagine, probably a pretty boozy lunch. And then after lunch, they went to the Liberace Museum, where a sort of Jim J. Bullock kind of very gay docent of the Liberace Museum brought them to see the Holy of Holies at the Liberace Museum, the world's largest rhinestone. And when they unveiled it, my mom and all of her friends burst out laughing and got ejected from the Liberace Museum. And I put it to you that Liberace's largest rhinestone, which is a fake gem, is both fake and gay. And so there you go. Something can be fake and gay.
Wow. I think you convinced me, actually. I went into the story very skeptical. I didn't see how you could possibly get there.
I don't think that's what Candace Owens had in mind, but yeah. So there you go.
Something in common with the moon landing and the largest sequin in the world. Okay, well, with that, congratulations again on the SCOTUS blog acquisition, and congratulations to all of us. I don't know who I'm congratulating in this other than
congratulations to you.
Yeah, congratulations to you guys. I mean, let's put it this way. Congratulations to me and Steve for nominally getting some weird credit for it. And congratulations to you guys for the incredibly hard work and important work you guys are going to be doing. Because it doesn't put a lot of new stuff on my plate, but it does put a lot of new stuff on yours. And I'm happy for it.